Thank you for joining us today. My name is Deborah Entenman. I represent the 47th Legislative District, and I am the immediate past chair of the Washington State Black Member Caucus. We are here to address the issues of Black and Indigenous and other people of color in communities that communities have been facing for far too long. That issue is unnecessary police violence and the lack of accountability and transparency. Millions of peaceful protesters across the nation and even the world cried out in anger this summer following the death of George Floyd at the hand of the Minneapolis police. But it is not simply enough that it is not simply a Minnesota problem. It is not just a Seattle problem or an urban issue. This is a problem that affects every corner of our state. This is a problem that affects rural communities, tribal communities, immigrant communities, suburban communities, urban communities. It affects us all in Western Washington. It affects us in Eastern Washington. This problem requires solutions at the highest level. Unnecessary police violence and a complete lack of accountability for that violence has eroded the community's trust in law enforcement. When entire communities do not trust the state-sanctioned power over life and death, public safety is in peril. Recognizing the need for leadership from communities that are disproportionately impacted, the House created a police policy leadership team in June. The representatives that make up this group include John Lovick, Jesse Johnson from the Black Member Caucus, Deborah Lakanoff, Milan Tai, and Bill Ramos from the Member of Color Caucus, as well as the Public Safety Chairperson, Roger Goodman. We have spent the last 6 months listening to community, meeting with a wide range of stakeholders, and looking for ways to rebuild the community trust in law enforcement. We have found that there can be no trust where there is no accountability. And the system for holding police officers accountable in Washington state are lacking. To rebuild trust, we must ensure that preserving and protecting human life is our highest value. We must make sure that the tactics and equipment that the police are using honor the value, and then we must put the systems of accountability and transparency in place to ensure that value. Only once we make these changes can we begin to rebuild the community trust. Throughout this summer, we have sought to center the lived experience of those who have lost loved ones to unnecessary police violence. The Washington Coalition for Police Accountability has been one of our most important partners, and we have invited them here today to join us as we introduce our police accountability agenda for the session. These families have turned unimaginable pain into relentless advocacy for justice. Their strength and perseverance and determination are a constant source of inspiration. It is only right that in this moment, we listen to their voices and to their stories. We are joined today by Davita Briscoe, the sister of Che Taylor, Sonia Joseph, the mother of Giovanni Joseph McDade, Annalisa Thomas, the mother of Leonard Thomas, and Katrina Johnson, the cousin of CHARLEENA LYLES. Thank you all for your advocacy. We mourn your loss with you, and we promise that your efforts will not be in vain. We are committed to finally creating systems of police accountability and transparency that will allow our communities to have faith in the equal application of the law. We are committed to preserving and protecting every human life, and we are committed to justice. Thank you. It is my honor to now introduce Ms. Davita Briscoe.
Good afternoon. I am Davita Briscoe. I'm the sister of Che Taylor. My brother Andre Taylor and I and his wife Dove started Not This Time, a grassroots organization. Not only are we advocating for Che, but we are also advocating for other families who have lost loved ones to police violence. Che was killed in February of 2016 by Seattle police. No one has ever been prosecuted in his death. his hands were up, he was complying with officers' commands, and he was unarmed. The officers who killed him made no effort to use anything but deadly force. Not This Time has worked tremendously hard to get Initiative 940 passed. We're here today to say there is a lot more work that we need to be doing. The death of George Floyd, the murder and cover-up of Manuel Ellis brings us to this moment. And I want to call out the depth of racism in this country. We all saw the white nationalists and their insurrection in Washington, D.C., who brought Confederate flags to the halls of Congress. On behalf of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability, I want to thank the House Policing Policy Leadership and Senate Law and Justice Committee for working with us for the last 6 months on learning the issues and focusing on what matters. The Washington Coalition for Police Accountability is focused on 5 proposals to change the culture of policing. Each proposal is important because what we need is transformation. This is a time that requires boldness and courage. We are asking all of Washington to stand with us and demand legislation that addresses police culture and accountability. Representative Johnson is going to be introducing the proposal on the use of force and de-escalation. The use of force proposal moves us beyond training to a statewide requirement to de-escalate. It includes standards for use of physical force, and it sets out the expectations that we require of our officers in their daily work. It requires that a police officer must use de-escalation tactics before resorting to use of physical force. It requires that the officer must avoid creating situations that require force. It describes what de-escalation is, addressing behavior we saw in my brother's death, such as stating that officers should create physical distance and cover, and designating one officer to communicate to avoid competing commands. The use of force proposal also makes an important change to the criminal defense for officer use of deadly force. We propose putting the emphasis on whether the deadly force was necessary, not whether it was reasonable. If the officer or the public is in imminent threat of serious physical harm, then deadly force is justifiable as a last resort. We believe these changes will make our community safer and the job of the officer safer. Thank you for your time today, and I'm going to turn it over to Sonia.
Thank you. I'm Sonia Joseph. Policing culture and policies need to change. Our legislative agenda includes House Bill 1054, which had a hearing this morning at 8 a.m. House Bill 1054 is about policing tactics and equipment. This legislation says some tactics are so bad and violent that police should not use them. It also addresses some tactics by adding restrictions. What we have seen as a community, and what we experience every day is discriminatory policing. House Bill 1054 says no more. I am the mother of Giovanni Joseph McDade. He was killed by Camp Police June 24, 2017. He was a 20-year-old student and loved by his family and friends. Sadly, my losses repeated across the state and the nation. Each year in Washington state, over 40 people are killed by police. In 2017, 42 people were killed in Washington by law enforcement. This is a mass casualty, and we need to address and treat it like one. My son was killed after a routine traffic stop, another senseless murder of an innocent Black man. My son complied to a traffic stop and later fled the scene. Running away does not warrant a death sentence. Officers pursued a vehicle pursuit and the use of deadly force. In just under 2 minutes, my son was killed by 2 shots. Officers escalated the situation by using a pit maneuver and the box trap. Both officers trapped my son, while Officer Davis walked around his patrol car out into the street onto the side of my son's vehicle and shot 2 times. These shots killed my son. The bullets went in his heart and lung. Officer Davis claims to have feared for his life when he walked towards the side of my son's vehicle while using deadly force. Giovanni was not a threat. He was unarmed. He was a young man who was trying to get away and save his life. Officers murdered him recklessly. Officers acted above the law. They did not have permission to engage in an unsupervised vehicle pursuit. House Bill 1054 puts in place a restrictive protocol and requirements that take the adrenaline out of the decision-making so that the chase only happens under strict protocols, and public safety outweighs the risks of the pursuit. It also restricts shooting at moving vehicles. House Bill 1054 also bans neck restraints and chokeholds. This is a brutal and inhumane tactic we watched as George Floyd and Manuel Ellis died. Neck restraints require intensive training and are hard to correctly do in a moment. The ban also prohibits police dogs off leashes. Police dogs are used against Black Americans at the rate 3 times of white Americans, and dogs are also used most exclusively against people of color. The ban of tear gas, which is a chemical agent that is banned in war, we should not use it against civilians. The ban also addresses the use of military equipment by police and bans it. The police should not be accompanying forces of war with the community. Data shows that military equipment correlates more killings by police agencies. House Bill 10 also says police should not cover their badges because it clouds their identity and reduces their accountability. It also bans the no-knock warrants so that what happened to Breonna Taylor should not happen to anyone. Let's step up to this problem. These tactics have been used to intimidate and terrorize communities of color for generations. We cannot continue to operate under outdated policies and practices. Enacting these bans and restrictions will save lives and increase the well-being of people of color, especially Black, Latino, and Native American. When communities can trust their safety while having an encounter with law enforcement, that is when the bridge to restorative healing happens. Thank you. And now you'll hear from Annalisa Thomas.
Thank you, Sonia. Good afternoon. I am Annalisa Thomas. I am a member of the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. My husband and I founded Next Steps Washington. I'm going to talk about Senator Peterson and Representative Goodman's proposals for police oversight and accountability. These are SB 5051 and HB 1082. Our son Leonard was murdered by a Pierce County SWAT team sniper in 2013. Leonard was unarmed and he never threatened him to harm himself, police, or his son. He was not a criminal and there were no warrants for his arrest. He had been sober for nearly 18 months. He had lost a lifelong friend to an unexpected illness. He was drunk and I called police for help. In the course of the night, for my drunk, grieving son, police brought in a SWAT team, 2 Bearcats, and 29 armed officers. Police instructed me to call to Leonard, telling him to bring Elijah out to their porch. I naively trusted them, and only seconds later, they blew up his back door, and when he jumped to protect his son, they shot him in front of me. His death was avoidable. Leonard was Elijah's father and vitally important in his life. We sued the involved agencies in federal court and prevailed on every count. They also concluded that 3 officers' actions were so egregious, the jury decided these officers were directly responsible for the unnecessary death of our son. Instead of being held accountable for their actions, all 3 officers have been promoted to positions of leadership and are held in high esteem within the law enforcement community. One is a chief of police, another holds a lead sniper position. The 3rd officer proclaimed in an after-incident interview, the shot that killed Leonard was a frickin' $1 million shot. He also thought that he and his fellow officers deserved massages because they had worked so hard. Afterwards, he was promoted to a critical incident trainer. I find this particularly troubling. When law enforcement harms someone without facing consequences, there is no justice for the victim, nor incentive to change. Reforms are critically necessary to bring about true police accountability. We think that SR 5051 and HB 1082 will help immensely. It strengthens the licensing of law enforcement and correction officers to make it more difficult for problem officers to move from one jurisdiction to the other. This legislation adds 3 more community members to the Criminal Justice Commission. I need to emphasize, community must be involved in oversight if we want to change police culture. We support the Oversight and Accountability Bill because it will allow a review of this type of misconduct, and officers will face a range of discipline, including termination. It requires employers to report serious discipline action and misconduct to the CJTC and allows licensing action for wrongdoing that involves racism. Enacting these key changes, accountability will address officer misconduct and has real actionable consequences. We are hopeful that this legislative session will produce strong laws that will narrow the scope in which an officer can use deadly force and implement strong accountability when deadly force is used. To achieve change, we must first acknowledge inequities do exist. Then our lawmakers must have the courage and conviction to pass new laws that will reflect a society where saving every life becomes paramount and taking a life will become uncommon. Thank you. And now I would like to turn it over to Katrina.
Good afternoon. I am Katrina Johnson, the cousin of CHARLEENA LYLES. CHARLEENA was killed by Seattle police on June 18, 2017. not only the same month as Giovanni Joseph McDade, but only 6 days before he was killed. Our family has been working tirelessly for justice for CHARLEENA. She was killed in her home, in front of her children. She was 100 pounds and 14 weeks pregnant. She should still be alive. Folks experiencing mental health crisis should not be condemned to their death. Part of dismantling this system that is rooted in white supremacy is putting strong accountability measures in place. We are past training as a solution. We need to hold officers accountable. We think consequences will motivate a change in police culture. As you heard, we need to take violent tactics off the table. We need to require that police de-escalate and use deadly force as a last resort. We need to look at the misconduct of police officers and get officers out of the profession who are unethical and immoral. And we need accountability. We are working with Representative Tai on legislation that will allow people to go to court and enforce the duty to de-escalate and use reasonable care. We are looking forward to Representative Tai making sure that police are held to the standard of care. Police have serious jobs. Police officers have an important job and responsibilities, and police departments should be accountable for their duties, just like other professions. I served on the governor's task force on independent investigations of police use of force. The task force developed recommendations for how to get local police out of investigations and how to get local prosecutors away from these cases. The issue for the community is that police cannot investigate police. It is impossible. Let's be real. The local prosecutors are also in a position where they have a conflict of interest. Again, we need to be real. If we want to solve the problem of doing investigations that families and communities can trust, we must be prepared to put something in place that is credible and legitimate. Look at the investigation into the murder of Manuel Ellis. This happened after 940 was passed. It was unacceptable that the investigation was actually a cover-up and that the police officers who killed Manuel Ellis have still not been arrested for his murder to this day. This is what we are up against as families. Systems that protect the status quo. Please work with the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. We want a statewide system for independent investigation with professional investigators who are not law enforcement. And we want a statewide prosecutor who is independent of the county prosecutors. And listen closely, we want to make sure that homicides like my cousin, John T. Williams, Stonechild Chief Stick, and Billy Langford, and all of the others can be reopened so that justice is served. Without making these changes, the lack of trust will continue and accountability will be out of our reach. Thank you. And at this time, I will hand it over to Representative Johnson.
Thank you so much, Katrina. It's an honor to follow you and speak today. I want to again begin by thanking the families from the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability. Your courage and continued advocacy for justice through unimaginable suffering is an inspiration to us all. The people of this state owe you a debt of gratitude that can never truly be repaid. We have worked extensively with the coalition, organizers, and other families impacted by police violence for over 6 months. Censoring the lives of those that have been lost to unnecessary police violence has been central to our work. As Rep. Intamin said, we believe that preserving and protecting human life should be law enforcement's highest value. It is clear to me and to so many others across our state that law enforcement does not always honor that value, especially when the situation involves people of color. Our policing policy leadership team has worked with intentionality, meeting with a wide range of stakeholders from organizers and civil rights advocates with Washington for Black Lives and Black Lives Matter, to the different police unions representing officers in our state. We believe that the priorities of the coalition are the most important and fundamental to changing how law enforcement in Washington operates. With that in mind, we have introduced bills in response to each of their priorities. I am proud to sponsor House Bill 1054, which regulates and restricts certain police tactics and equipment. As we have seen most recently this year, when certain tactics are used at all, they are far too often disproportionately used against Black and Brown communities. This bill will ban chokeholds and neck restraints, no-knock warrants, tear gas, unleash police dogs for the purpose of arresting an individual, and covering badge numbers. It also restricts vehicular pursuits, which are extremely dangerous to the general public, the suspect and law enforcement. Firing at moving vehicles will be prohibited, and certain types of military equipment as well. I will also be sponsoring a bill to adopt a statewide de-escalation standard and duty of care, and to revise the justifiable use of force standard. Police officers hold the power of life and death over people. De-escalating conflict must be their first instinct in how they are trained. This bill will mandate de-escalation tactics and clarify the definitions in the use of deadly force standard, to require that deadly force is a last resort that is necessary to protect only against an imminent threat of serious injury or death. Representative Intamin, in coordination with the governor's office and in line with the governor's task force on independent investigations, is introducing 2 bills to establish an agency to independently and impartially investigate killings by police, deaths in custody, and accusations of sexual assault, and to ensure that charging decisions are made by an independent prosecutor and not by district attorneys who work hand in hand with their local police forces. Representative Neelan Tai is introducing legislation, as was mentioned, to create a state-level civil cause of action for the violation of constitutional rights. This bill enhances current law and creates a new avenue for accountability when an officer violates a person's state constitutional rights. It will prevent future policy misconduct by properly incentivizing departments to properly train and discipline their force as well. Representative Roger Goodman has introduced House Bill 1082, the State Oversight and Accountability Act. This will reform the composition of the Criminal Justice Training Commission, as well as the process for decertifying an officer from the state of Washington. This legislation expands the grounds on which an officer can be decertified and clarifies that an officer does not have to be fired before they can be decertified for their conduct. It also changes the composition of the CJTC to increase community representation. These bills represent the 5 main priorities of this coalition and the most important work that we can do on police accountability this year. However, we have been working closely with our colleagues over in the Senate and introduced a number of other necessary reforms, including duty to intervene and report as well, requiring departments to collect data on use of force incidents and other interactions with the public, reforming the process for selecting arbitrators, and mandating community oversight boards across our state, as well as auditing previous investigations completed after the passage of I-940. We stand in solidarity with our families, with our community. Unnecessary police violence must end. We believe that the legislation that we are proposing this year will help to rebuild trust in our law enforcement by mandating transparency and accountability. We believe these changes will make everyone in Washington safer, but an emphasis on Black and Brown communities who have disproportionately and historically, as well as currently, bear the burden of unnecessary police violence. Thank you. We will now take questions.
We're going to go to Sarah first with the first question, because we know she had one. To the media, if you do have a question, please raise your hand or use one of the emoji buttons, reaction buttons, so we know. But we're going with Sarah first, and then Chris Ingles, because we know they had questions.
Thank you. This is Sarah Gensler with McClatchy. So today we heard some testifiers take issue with some pieces of House Bill 1054, saying it removes opportunities for de-escalation or, counter to its intent, puts members of the public and officers at risk. Do you have a response to those comments? And then to what extent do you expect to negotiate aspects of that bill and others on the agenda? And that's for a lawmaker who feels comfortable answering it.
This is Representative Goodman. I'm the chair of the Public Safety Committee, and we convened that meeting first thing today to hear that important bill related to tactics. And very soon we will be sitting down with a wider group of stakeholders to talk about some of the provisions where there might be disagreement. I'm going to yield to Representative Johnson to talk about responses to the concerns that you reflected.
Thank you, Chair Goodman. Could someone repeat those specific responses that were mentioned?
I'm happy to. I think, so kind of broadly, there are a few people who mentioned that counter to its intent, they thought it would remove opportunities for de-escalation and might put members of the public and officers at risk.
Well, I would love to start by saying I think that that's not true. I think one of the things we have to think about is we have different standards across our state, and that kind of further sows distrust, right, amongst community and law enforcement. So by putting together statewide standards around tactics and other issues, we can at least say whether you're in one jurisdiction or another, you'll have the same standard. And we also know that from the data, looking at national data, looking at our state data, that far too often a lot of these tactics are used in Black and Brown communities or in situations where the Black and Brown community is involved. And I think that we must make sure that we have accountability that's fair and equitable across the system. I don't think, for example, tear gas, which is not used by our current military, should be used in our communities. I don't think that chokeholds, as we saw with George Floyd and Manuel Ellis, should be used in our communities. I don't think no-knock warrants, like we saw with Breonna Taylor, should be used in our communities. I think we notice a theme here by the individuals involved. So I really would say we must look at this through an equity lens, and I think that's how we get to the right policy.
Thank you. We're going to a question we know that Chris Ingalls has from King 5.
Hi there. Thank you very much. And thank you all for your time on a very important subject. A question for the lawmakers. I work for King TV, and over the course of the summer into the fall, we did a survey of every police department in the state of Washington. I think all but 5 departments answered our survey on the use of police body-worn cameras. And we found really a couple of things. We found that there's a lot of police departments that do not have them. The days when police departments didn't want them are really over, and the majority of chiefs told us that they would like to have body-worn cameras on their officers, but the expense of not the purchase of the equipment originally, but the expense of managing the data, managing things like records requests is what held them up. So my question is for lawmakers. Is there anything you can do to help these departments that want body cameras, but don't think they can afford them? Because it is the question that we all ask when one of these shootings happens, is there body cam footage?
Thank you, Chris. This is Representative Goodman. We have been discussing body-worn cameras and means to expand their use. There is not right now a call in the legislature for instance, a statewide mandate that body-worn cameras be used by every department. And as you mentioned, there's significant expense and both the contracting with the vendor as well as full-time employees that need to deal with the public records requests. We are in the middle right now of a pilot program that was enacted by the legislature where I believe 12 or 13 police agencies around the state are working through a protocol for how to deploy body-worn cameras. I think as the first step, the next step, we should permit any other police agency that wants to join that pilot program to join in. The question of resources to help departments, purchase and maintain the technology is an open one. But frankly, if there are state resources needed at this time, it really is to improve the Criminal Justice Training Commission and its oversight, to set up the independent investigation office that's been proposed out of the governor's office, to establish databases to provide much more transparency to the public about police activity. So there are other priorities ahead of buying body-worn cameras for police agencies statewide, but we will consider cost sharing in the future.
Thank you. We're going to Essex Porter now with a question we know he has.
Yes, and hoping that Representative Lovick is still there, because I wanted to direct this question to Representative Lovick as someone who's spent a career in law enforcement. I would like your opinion on whether you feel that these changes go too far in leaving officers defenseless and officers unable to help the public.
Essex, thank you, and it is a great question. And just so you'll know, Essex, and I've said this more than a few times, I kind of consider myself black, brown, and blue. I'm a black man, brown skin tone, and I wore the blue uniform for 31 years. And so there's no question about it that I have some challenges that I have to address. But what we need to do, and as I look at this, Essex, I'm just of the opinion that we have to do what is best for the state of Washington. I do not think it goes too far, but I think there will have to be some adjustments in some of the things. For example, the tear gas situation. I'm kind of torn with that one because I just remembered this summer seeing some tear gas being sprayed in a location so that I thought it was tear gas, so that the president could go in and take a photograph. I wonder about things like that. How do we say that's okay, but yet at the same time we're challenged with how we deal with this? So to answer your question, Essex, I do not think it goes too far. I think it's time that we have some changes, and these are the changes that I think will be best for the citizens of the state of Washington.
Would you feel safe as a law enforcement officer working under these rules?
Essex, I would. You know, we're in a different time now than we were in when I started in law enforcement over 40 years ago. And we have to build some trust and some accountability in the community. And I think I would feel safe, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much. I don't see raised hands from reporters, but I want to give everyone who's still on the call a chance to ask their questions. So I'm going to go to Jim from the Seattle Times next, if he has a question. Is Jim there? If Jim's not there, Laurel from the Spokesman Review is on the call. Laurel, do you have a question?
Sure. I'm wondering if you can talk about, if any of the lawmakers could talk a little bit more about how you chose these specific policies to bring up this year, and I guess the likelihood that this whole sweeping package will pass, or if there are a few that you're kind of focusing on and prioritizing that you want to see pass this session.
I'll give that a start here. After the national demonstrations began, after the killing of George Floyd, it was pretty clear that even here in Washington State, there's a lot of unfinished business. And so as chair of the Public Safety Committee, I reached out to the members here on this call, the other lawmakers, to form the policing policy leadership team. And in a very deliberate fashion, through listening sessions and research nationally, and also in particular, listening to the families from the Washington Coalition for Police Accountability and taking our cue from them as to what were their priorities because of their experience. We identified these topics that are now expressed through legislation. And it just so happens that other states around the country, including Virginia and Connecticut and Colorado and Minnesota and Oregon, have enacted or are considering very similar pieces of legislation. related to tactics, to discipline and sanctions, to investigations and prosecution, and to data collection, and even collective bargaining issues. So these topics are not just picked out of the air. They're very carefully considered, very deliberately crafted, and form a comprehensive package that builds on the progress we made with Initiative 940. But as I said, there's a lot of work left to be done since Initiative 940. And so it covers the waterfront, but we believe is a comprehensive package that's going to make a big difference for public safety.
Thank you for that question and that answer. I see that there's a few more reporters on this that we want to get through to. I'm looking for Sydney from the Washington Journal. Sydney, do you have a question?
Hi there. I do actually. I know that you guys touched on this a little bit about how some of the
We're losing your audio.
Some use or some. Can you hear me?
Now we can.
Okay. Yeah, just let me know if I keep cutting out. But there were a few testimonies that said that they would be okay with banning some techniques, like the use of chokeholds, but not necessarily in favor of banning the use of vascular neck restraints. So I was just wondering how much willingness there is to make those sorts of concessions and negotiations of certain techniques.
I could go ahead and answer that. Thank you so much for the question. I think we had a really good hearing this morning. I'm actually really proud of our committee and the folks that testified, both in support and against, having a really clear, vision for what both sides wanted. I think what we have to do moving forward is work together in collaboration to come up with a policy that represents everyone in the state. I will say, though, in talking with a lot of law enforcement across the state of Washington, there is not a clear and concise standard for neck restraints, for example. And I think that anything that's going to be standardized, we must have clear training for it. And so I think we have to look at all of these tactics with an equity lens and how it's being used, but also looking at what officers are being provided in terms of training. And when you talk with the Fraternal Order of Police, when you talk with different sheriffs across the state and different police chiefs, they say really bluntly that they don't have the training to do these tactics. And so I think that goes back to how are we making sure our communities are safe so officers on the ground actually have an idea of what they're supposed to do. And I think it just shows with our data that we can't have certain tactics that are being used when they're not being trained on. So there are room for concessions as we go through this process. There always is. That's what a democracy is. But I think that it's important to look at all of these issues through an equity lens and get perspectives from all sides.
Thank you very much. If anyone has a follow-up question, please hit the raise hand function or otherwise make whatever Zoom noise you can, and we'll try to get that. I'm going to try, I'd like to try the Seattle Times one more time in case he wasn't paying attention for that second. See if Jim has a question. Okay, I think that's it. If lawmakers want to give some brief closing remarks.
I'll just, I suppose, thank everyone for participating, particularly the members from the families of those who lost loved ones in their interactions with police. We thank you for your contributions over the last 7 months to our work, and we are following you in terms of what your priorities are. The bill that we heard this morning related to police tactics, we're hitting the ground running on this whole topic. It's a priority for us and the majority for both the House and the Senate, and we're closely coordinating between the House and the Senate. And you're going to see many more bills come before the Public Safety Committee in the next few days, this week and the week after next, the whole comprehensive package. So we're not going to relent in our efforts to move responsible legislation forward to hold police accountable for misconduct, to uphold the policing profession, and to improve police-community relations. And I really think we're going to be able to accomplish that this year.
And I'll just add this. This is Representative Lovick. You know, Representative Goodman talked about accountability. You know, in my time, at my almost 4 decades in law enforcement, police officers want to be held accountable. And I say this every chance I get, 99.9% of our officers are outstanding men and women. They go to work every single day to create a safe environment to not only have you be safe in your community, but have you make sure that you feel safe in your community. And I think legislation that we are proposing is going to strengthen that for officers. And we've heard many times that strength comes from the impulse to be fair and the willingness to be accountable. And what we believe we can hold our members or our police profession accountable. Thank you.
I can jump in really briefly. I want to second Representative Lovick's points around accountability, which really accountability is a constellation. There's so many different parts to it. And I think that's why we have so many different bills. A lot of folks are like, why are there so many bills around police reform? Well, we started with, I think Rep. Goodman can attest to this, maybe 60 something bills, and we've prioritized it down to the ones we believe and what community and the coalition believes are the most important. And that's what this is all about, is making sure that community is heard. The condition of truth is to allow suffering to speak, and that's what we've heard today. And I think it's really important that we center those voices in this process. As we move forward, I know that our police policy leadership team will be accessible to the public. I know it's really difficult this year with this virtual reality that we're in to make sure that we're connecting with everyone, as we saw this morning in the hearing. But we want to make sure we're hearing public comment about this. We're hearing from everyone across the state of Washington. And so we will continue to do that. But thank you for the time and the space.
I wanted to comment on that, what Representative Johnson just said in terms of access by the public and opportunity for people to comment and so forth. Today, we heard one bill. On Friday, we're going to hear just one bill for the entire public hearing period. Normally, in a legislative bill hearing, you have 4, 5, 6 bills. So we're really wanting to have thorough consideration of these measures, an opportunity for all parties to participate. So we want as much transparency and as much constructive criticism as possible.
If there's no other questions from the press, thank you all so much for coming, and thank you to all who participated, lawmakers and family members and other folks who listened in on this press conference. I know the technology is a little strange. Thank you so much.